I have a question for you. Let's say that there's a card that, by most considerations, is a great fit for a deck. It's pretty powerful, it meshes well with the way the deck functions mechanically, and it improves a specific aspect of the deck that was maybe a bit of a weak spot before. When is putting that card into that deck the wrong choice? Let's take a step back. Commander, as it is played by most of its player base, is a casual format. This means a lot of things to a lot of people, but the definition I'll use here is that a deck is casual when it is not perfectly optimal in terms of its ability to perform tasks and win games, and when this state of being is intentional. If you are a casual EDH player, by definition, there are cards in your deck that could be switched to different cards if you wanted to win more games and compete with more powerful decks. This is intuitively true to people when it comes to the cards that most visibly contribute to that winning, the win conditions. Not every deck includes the most powerful 2-card infinite combos in them, and even among the ones that do, not all of them run the sort of tutor density that would help their deck to execute said combos consistently. Plenty of casual EDH players understand that they'd prefer to win with Perforos and a bunch of goblins rather than Dualcaster plus Twin Flame, and another segment of casual EDH players understand that they'd prefer to win by attacking with the aforementioned goblins rather than dealing damage just by having them pop into existence. So this is an area where players tend to understand their preferences. However, as you pull back away from what shape a deck's win will look like and dive into the functional meat of decks, things get a little hazier. You may know approximately how you enjoy winning, but do you know what forms of resource building are most enjoyable to you? Do you know the sort of interaction suite and style of table engagement that will give you the most satisfying game? Do you know how powerful you want each of these components to be? This is likely an overwhelming sequence of questions to a lot of people, or even a baffling sequence of questions to some. This is a card game where you're, at least in some abstract sense, trying to win games, and the natural place a lot of people end up is finding the most powerful options out there, or at least playing with the best options they have access to. And by all means, don't let me tell you not to play good cards. I play lots of good cards. However, I am also here to tell you that there are some good cards that, like a Dualcaster Twin Flame combo, may influence the amount of fun you have with the game. Cards that may not even necessarily have anything to do directly with winning. What you find fun about playing your deck may be a lot more fragile than you think, much more sensitive to the blunt instrument of an out-of-place card or two than you'd expect. If this all sounds like it's gearing up for a bunch of aimless good card hate, well, why don't you just hear me out for a bit? This is all pretty abstract, so a couple recent examples of this I've experienced are probably in order. Quick side note, I also released a Patreon video recently that included some discussion of the new bracket system, and I'll be including a portion of that at the end of this video. Stick around for that if you feel like, but with that said, I want to start off with what may be a familiar example. In October of last year, I discussed my Malphegor deck, and that one is a vibes deck through and through. The basic gist is that it is a deck that pairs discard spells and small creatures to generate card advantage to try and force the game into a scrappy, low-resource state reminiscent of a lot of grindy 60 and 40 card gameplay. A state where my deck has an edge, but typically only a slight one. A gritty game plan, no doubt, and you're allowed to hate it, but I love the sorts of environments this deck can create, and I likewise enjoy the task of grinding advantage with a handful of low-cost creatures within those environments. With that in mind, a useful exercise for understanding what this deck wants is to consider two powerful cards, one that ended up in the final deck, and one that did not. Kroxa is a monster of a card. It's an effective discard engine that can give opponents a whiff of the pain to come as early as turn 2, and which also makes for a killer beater that is difficult to get rid of. It is very good at doing everything this deck wants to be good at, making opponents discard, being resilient, and applying life total pressure, and that congruence is why it works in the final deck, despite being a crazy good card in a low-slung budget deck. Waste Not, on the other hand, is a card that did not end up in the final deck, and that's because it is good at things the deck is not supposed to be good at. This is a grindy, mid-powered deck looking to plunge the game into a low-resource slugfest, and Waste Not handing me easy resources boosts me out of that state, changing the whole dynamic of the deck. The fun part of the deck for me is when I'm clawing for advantage in a scrappy game, and if a 2-mana enchantment just hands me a bunch of advantage, it shortcuts that, basically just turning my deck into a generic oppressive stacks deck in the process. This was the example of a good card being a bad idea that got me thinking harder about the concept, but there's a similar and even more striking recent example that ended up inspiring this video. In mid-January, I was looking at spoilers for Aetherdrift, seeing if there was anything new for my Shroom Astral Slide deck, and I saw the card Monument to Endurance. On the surface, this thing is a slam dunk in a cycling deck. Cycled cards get effortlessly transfigured into resources at the rate of 1 per turn, allowing for an easy card advantage engine that can pivot into a win condition, and which can even provide treasures where needed. Can you believe all of that could come from a single Magic card? It's almost too good to be true. Actually, not almost. It is too good to be true in this case. I discussed in my video about this deck that at its heart this is a control deck that cares about navigating a sequence of tricky choices about where to divert the deck's resources. Do I tutor for a high-cost artifact that gives me card advantage, or one that slows down my opponents? Do I flicker an ETB creature that shuts down a problematic spell or ability, or one that makes my board larger? Do I use Shroom's Recur ability to bring back a key blocker, or a card that pushes my own advantage? These are the sorts of choices that make this deck a highly fun and engaging experience for me when I'm looking to sit down and think hard during a game. The issue with Monument to Endurance, then, is that it shortcuts around this whole thing. Its ability doesn't compete with anything else in the deck, and the correct first choice per turn will almost always be card draw. Suddenly, easily the most effective draw engine in my deck isn't a multi-card flicker-based engine that I need to piece together and then operate with lots of decisions along the way. No, this is a do-thing-get-cards engine, where taking a game action, cycling in this case, is immediately and directly rewarded with drawing cards. This simplification of value generation decisions has a cascading effect of simplifying my tutoring decisions. It will almost always be correct to hunt up a one-piece engine like this, so my tutoring decisions will reflect that. I'll wizard cycle for a trophy mage to grab my Monument to Endurance, because anything else would be an irresponsible choice. Suddenly, the task of gaining advantage has one simple route of administration. Find the card that makes my cycling cards do more cycling, play it, and then the advantage makes itself. There are 2 other cards I exclude for similar reasons. The draw doublers Alhammarret's Archive and Teferi's Ageless Insight are undoubtedly strong in a cycling deck, but they're strong by shortcutting the value generating part of the deck, allowing me to get ahead by simply cycling rather than making use of Astral Slide and ETB creatures. These generic do-thing-get-card synergies would suck the identity and a lot of the interesting decision-making out of the deck, thereby removing a lot of what makes it fun to me. Now, you might assume based on what I just said that I hate all draw that's too generic or simple or powerful, or even that I dislike the sort of do-things-get-cards draw I mentioned earlier. That's not the case though. I dislike it in the case of my Shroom deck specifically because it shortcuts past what I find fun about the deck, simplifying the rich tapestry of decisions that the deck presents me with, and rendering the more interesting forms of value pointlessly weak by comparison. If you find the process of building advantage a particularly fun one, you'll want to be careful with the cards you add, but this won't be the case for all decks. I run a bunch of these sorts of simple, strong value engines I mentioned earlier in my Rada deck, Beast Whisperer and Garrick's Pack Leader and such like, and those feel great there. If anything, I wish my draw was even more straightforward sometimes. Many people who've seen me playing this deck have witnessed me exasperatedly resolving my 5th Radagast trigger in a turn, playing as quickly as I possibly can in order to keep my turn length under 5 minutes despite casting dozens of mana worth of spells. This is because exactly how I build advantage isn't something I care about. There are 2 things I find fun about playing this deck: having a ton of mana, which enables me to have these intense and complex turns with intricate ordering, and figuring out how to beat down my opponents with a big ol' pile of budget bombs. I do run draw in the deck, but I treat it as a means to an end, with that end being allowing me to spend my ample mana and not end up hellbent too much of the time. In the case of this deck, what would shortcut the fun would be running more powerful bombs and finishers that allow me to convert mana advantage into defeated opponents more efficiently. I like playing the role of a final boss with this deck, pumping my volume of gameplay up to seismic proportions before lumbering in the direction of victory with my large creatures. I do have ways to close out games, but they're not super fast or sudden unless I'm at 20 or more mana, and this gives opponents a fighting chance to claw their way back into the game and best me in some games. These big dynamic back and forths are some of my favorite games with the deck, and if I spent a bunch of effort tuning the deck to win faster, I wouldn't get these sorts of games nearly as often. For a similar example, let's talk about my friend Hans's Lila undefeated Slickshot deck, named Is It Bizit. This is a control-oriented deck that plays as many Prophetic Bolts as possible, with Prophetic Bolt as a category referring to an Izzet card that can both deal damage and draw 1 or more cards. When I asked Hans what he finds fun about the deck, he responded simply, "I like to 2-for-1 people twice." Prophetic Bolt in a 1v1 format is the archetypal mana-expensive 2-for-1 card. You pay 5 mana to hopefully remove a creature with 4 or less toughness, as well as finding a card in the top 4 cards of your library, thereby generating 2 cards worth of value with your 1 Magic the Gathering card. This type of card feels less impactful in EDH, what with its ample value engines and 2 additional opponents and such like, but allowing each of these spells to be used an additional time suddenly makes for a much more tempting proposition. The resulting deck looks to build value while keeping opponents in check, gradually adding additional mana in the form of mana rocks as well as occasional amplifier permanents, before trying to overwhelm opponents with value and gradually burn them down. It was one of these amplifier permanents that ended up being a problem for shortcutting the fun. Thousand-Year Storm. See, this deck typically keeps around a handful of plotted Izzet instants that were weaved onto an end step, holding them in exile until they're ready to be cast for free on a later main phase. This means that with a minimal amount of planning, a Thousand-Year Storm turn could easily reach 5 or more spells, which could mean that the final couple spells of the turn are being copied several times. This won't always be an immediate game win, but it effectively nullifies value as a concept in the deck. The deck is likely adding 10 or more cards to its hand each turn that Thousand-Year Storm is in play, and possibly digging dozens of cards deep into its library. Worse, Thousand-Year Storm negates the concept of mana as well. When a 5 or 6 cost card can be copied half a dozen times, the progression of adding on mana rocks and amplifiers becomes entirely pointless. Anything before the Thousand-Year Storm barely matters, and whether or not it results in an imminent game win more or less comes down to a removal check for opponents, unless the deck was far behind when the Storm came into play. So, Thousand-Year Storm does shortcut the fun in the case of this deck by pushing the deck beyond what it's supposed to care about, getting 2-for-1s. However, this isn't to say that all powerful amplifier permanents are off the table. The new Niv Mizzet printed in Foundations feels shockingly okay here. It does end up somewhat negating the resource of cards, but mana is still a big limiting factor for the deck. Not needing to worry nearly as much about value does change the nature of the deck, but the deck still feels like a version of itself, and the things that are fun about it still remain fun even if the play pattern becomes a bit different. The same goes for the card that ended up replacing Thousand-Year Storm. Swarm Intelligence certainly amplifies the deck's gameplay substantially, but it's still in the realm of being reasonable. The difference between a 2x amplification and a 3 to 4x amplification ends up being a lot more tangible than you'd expect. All 4 of these cases provide examples of ways to avoid shortcutting the fun, ways to experience the enjoyable part of decks for a greater percentage of the time you play them through simple card choice decisions. These probably seem simple when I present them like this, but these are play patterns that took months or longer to figure out, and decisions that often took trial and error to come to a firm conclusion about. In addition, these sorts of decisions might take a real change of deck building framework for players. So, what's a good place to start? For one, figure out what you find fun in decks. Pay attention to how you're feeling during games. When are you having the most fun? For a lot of people, it might be during the middle to later portions of games, where things are up and running, but before the deck is actively closing things out or losing. For those people, ask yourself, are there cards that might be winning your games prematurely, before your deck has spent the expected length of time building up to them, and before you spent as much time as you'd like savoring that part of the game? I find that avoiding a lot of higher-powered win cons is good for this. I often run tools that allow me to quickly eliminate a single player if I commit hard enough, but higher-level tools that will rapidly guarantee an all-out victory should be treated with care if you're not playing a deck that necessarily wants to win as fast as possible. This principle goes for accomplishing tasks as well. If there are a specific set of interactions that make a deck fun and meaningful to you, the worst possible thing you can do is add a different set of cards that does the same thing better and in a less interesting way. If you have a deck that focuses on dungeons and the initiative, adding in a Rhystic Study and a Trouble in Pairs will probably improve the deck, but suddenly you might find these unrelated cards outshining the set of value engines you built your whole deck around. Maybe that's fine if you're looking for raw power, but if that was my deck, I'd find that a bit of a bummer. For other players, the win might be the highlight of the game. If you find wins at any cost enjoyable, you should probably go out and find your local CEDH community. But for everybody else, you should ask yourself, what makes wins feel satisfying? I know I enjoy winning games when it feels earned, when it feels like I've outplayed my opponents and overcome challenges. This can be tackled from a lot of different directions, but there are cases where avoiding cards that accomplish tasks too efficiently can help with this. Put bluntly, it's really not very hard to make an EDH deck that wins games if you're willing to throw the best cards into a deck and learn how to play them in the right order. I don't tell you to exclude good cards because I have some sort of vendetta against them. I tell you that doing that in some cases might be worth considering because running some of the less flashy tools this game has to offer makes the game more enjoyable, more interesting, more textured for me, and it also makes wins more satisfying. Completing the same task with much more niche hardware is a lot of fun and can engage a lot of deck building and gameplay muscles that just aren't fully engaged if you're playing with top of the line materials. This can even go for decks that flirt with a more combo-oriented playstyle. I released a video about a $25 eggs deck in mid last year, and the main thrust of that video was that not having access to a key mana engine, Krark Clan Ironworks, forced the deck to traverse its explosive storm game plan in much more intentional and dynamic ways than would be required if it did have access to KCI. Playing with weaker connecting materials and payoffs can really bring out some more fun and textured elements from explosive decks, which might otherwise effortlessly combo off and win. I also want to acknowledge that putting worse cards in a deck is hard. It goes against the deck building instincts of a lot of people, and the idea that it might be the correct choice to produce the most fun experience might be kind of alarming if it's not a thought you've tangled with before. Optimization is a big piece of deck building in a game like Magic the Gathering, and I'd be a liar if I pretended that optimization wasn't a big piece of what informs the way I play the game. Depending on who you ask, I'd probably be categorized as a Spike or a Melvin, and the idea of building a maximally effective machine for purposes of crushing my opponents is one that will never stop being appealing to me. But casual EDH as a format is just that. It's a casual social format. Winning can never be the only concern, and to enjoy this format long term, you need to find things that are meaningful to you outside of crushing your opponents. The solution isn't even necessarily to abandon the optimization instinct, but rather to optimize for something that isn't raw power level. You can think of it as optimizing for fun, but it's going to be easier to tackle if you identify some more specific goal. For me, that's building a deck that embodies a specific feeling through its design, a specific vibe. But for you, that might be something different. Building a deck that best utilizes Dollhouse of Horrors. Building the most effective turtle deck. Building the most turtley deck that's still effective. Whatever it is, identify it and chase it. Your efforts will be rewarded. Thanks for watching, and thanks to Architect for supporting the channel. Architect is my deck building site of choice due to its satisfying visual layout and well-designed category system. A link to my decks is in the description. Thank you to my patrons as well for making what I do here possible, and here's a preview of a patron-only video I released that discussed the bracket system. I think the other reason is because, they're kind of showing their hand with the sort of version of EDH they want to promote here. They're okay with a deck that has a random infinite combo in it that might pop off at some point. They don't want decks that consistently do their infinite combos, but the version of EDH where you'll just have a random infinite combo that pops off some percentage of the time, just adding to the kind of variance of the game, that seems to be part of the format they're prescribing here, both in the bracket system and in the fact that precons have gotten infinite combos. I don't like that personally. It'll be interesting to see where this goes from here, but that's just kind of my hunch for why the infinite combo limitations chosen are really quite arbitrary and not very toothful in preventing, gameplay. I think the most generous version of the infinite combo prescriptions you could take is to say that they are trying to gesture at the sorts of gameplay you would want. So, you don't have 2-card infinite combos in precons, so you shouldn't do anything equivalent to playing a 2-card infinite combo at any point in the game. A fast 3-card infinite combo, okay, you should maybe take the gesture of no 2-card infinite combos to say maybe I should hold off on that. Likewise, for bracket 3, no fast 2-card infinite combos. They're not saying anything about 3-card infinite combos, but, maybe do something that falls in line with no fast 2-card infinite combos. That's the best I got for interpreting that. But yeah, I think infinite combos are a very strange kind of spot of this whole bracket system.